just give you a quick run through of exactly what the format of this particular panel is going to be. Then I'll do my brief introductions and try and get people's names right, because I always get them wrong. And then we'll move on to the questions. And I'm going to run this a little bit more of an open type of forum as well. So when I ask questions, and when we get our responses, if there's anything that you feel is supplemental onto that and you would like to draw out more information, that's your opportunity to do that. And we're not going to do the questions till the end. You can do that during the actual panel briefing. So we are going to spend some time doing some welcome and framing, which is I'm doing now. We're going to have an opening round, which will be about 5 minutes in total. We'll go a thematic deep dive. We'll be looking at 4 specific areas: compliance opportunities and challenges, cross-border regulatory complexities, retail sector developments, and market evolution strategies. Then we'll finish off with a brief lightning round where we give our panelists the opportunity to talk about their specific areas or any key points that they want to get across. So without further ado, I should do some brief introductions now. So my panel is made up of Tim, Ciprian and Peter. I shall just introduce Tim to you now. So Tim is the founder and MD of, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Tamarind Intelligence, a global independent market and regulatory intelligence firm serving vape, cannabis, alternative nic, and more. Tim is a UK qualified solicitor. He has a master's in geology from Oxford, and he's been steering his company for over a decade. And if you need to find out any intelligence about alternative markets, such as cannabis, vape, nicotine pouches, this is the man to come to see. So we're very pleased to have Tim on this panel. If you could just show your appreciation. Thank you very much. We've also got Ciprian. So Chip is the co-founder of IEVA, and I'm very proud I got said his name right for the first time ever. Or was it close? It was close. He's the co-founder of the Independent European Vape Alliance. He is a serial entrepreneur with nearly 20 years in highly regulated sectors. He's the chair of the Romanian Vape Industry Association, and he's deeply involved in IEVA's governance and work to effect positive change in the category across Europe. And I personally thank him for his work, because leading IEVA and the work that IEVA are doing in the face of significant challenges is very important. So thank you for the work that you're doing. If you could just put your hands together for We also have Peter, who is the president of the CEDT. He has asked me kindly not to try and pronounce his last name. I did have a go at it earlier, and he just suggested that I just say Peter. So we're going to stick with that. He's the president of the CEDT, the Brussels-based umbrella group uniting national tobacconists and tobacco retailers associations across Europe. Since 2015, he has represented the Austrian Tobacconist Association in Brussels. He's a native of Lower Austria. He balances his political and regulatory work as a father of 2 children, and he's also an Ironman, which is very impressive. So please put your hands together for Peter. So I'm just going to do some kick-off sort of prompts with our expert panelists here. So for starting with you, Tim, first of all, with over a decade of experience in marketing regulatory intelligence across fast-evolving customer sectors and a background as a UK qualified attorney, formalising novel nicotine insights, I want to ask you, Tim, how large is the global nicotine pouch market today, and how does it compare to overall novel nicotine products?
Right. Thanks, Robert, for very, very specific first question. I will try and answer it, but let me just give you a bit of background. So we've been around for as Robert said, over 10 years. When we started this, we started it really with the last TPD, so the last round of the Tobacco Product Directive when it was being negotiated, and we felt like there was an opportunity. But if you cast your eyes back to the market back then, it was almost at zero. And I'm very pleased to, and these days I kind of bring this up all the time. So the novel nicotine market, so I'm talking about heated tobacco plus vape plus nicotine pouch, is worth over $80 billion a year at the moment. And I think it's an amazing change that I have seen happen in the time that we've been around, if you like. Just to put that into context, we're talking about a combustible cigarette market, of which you still see most of the halls, are focused on that market. That is worth about $800 million a year. So this sector that we're talking about today in terms of novel nicotine is still only 10% of that, but it is the 10% that is growing really fast. And as Robert has asked me, for nicotine pouch, of that sector, it's growing even faster than the other two, than heated tobacco and vape. Right. So to put the nail on the head, as you said, Robert, in terms of size, we think that the pouch market is worth between $7.5 and $8 billion. It's the smallest part of the novel nicotine category, but as I said earlier, it's definitely the fastest moving, it's the fastest growing. And what is really interesting, and I just came from a panel next door looking at the kind of Swedish and Nordic story. This is a product that has come from the Swedish market, clearly. Sweden has this background in snus and has developed a nicotine pouch. But what's really interesting about this, I think, is that it is developing in all sorts of new markets. So all of these new markets coming online, the UK, the US is booming in terms of nicotine pouch, and I'm sure we can talk more about that. But anyway, so as I said, it's a small part of novel nicotine right now. It's growing really fast. I think there are huge opportunities, and I'm sure we'll talk about it.
Thank you, Tim. Just moving on to you then, Ciprian. So IEVA represents independent vape businesses across the EU, advocating for differentiated regulation, harm reduction, and coordination among SMEs. So on the harm reduction message, how is IEVA navigating the challenges of promoting harm reduction? And I should just point out as well to you, which I should have done at the start, that Ciprian's organisation IEVA is focused primarily on vape. So when we talk about alternative products, he will be including a whole gamut of products, not specifically novel nicotine products.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Yes, the harm reduction stays in the this is our starting point, let's say, because we believe that through vaping, it is harm reduction, and vaping can eventually help the over 100 million smokers from Europe to switch to a less harmful alternative, and eventually, yes, switch off the nicotine. Our main goal is to promote this principle and to fight for a differentiation. We see in many countries right now in Europe, we have some countries that are regulating vapes as different and taxing vape different, but many countries, they don't make any differentiation. So I would call it, our mantra is the solution is differentiation. Different, very clear through regulations, through taxations, the risk-reduced profile of the vaping compared to combustible cigarettes. It is a pretty tough job because the messages are mixed, because let's say the scientific world or the medical world doesn't offer enough support, and that's the moment when I personally believe that the big change will come when the whole medical world will come and look at the evidence and will send the message out there to the policymakers, which would eventually regulate in the proper way.
And what about youth usage and market restrictions?
Again, clear regulations that allow access and allow information to the adult smokers, but in the same time protecting the kids, protecting the youth. When we speak about youth access, one thing that first comes to my mind is the way the products are promoted. So we need, I would say, improvement when it comes to legislation on the packaging and on the communication, but in the same time keeping in mind that we need to keep the info for the adult smoker. And let's not forget the fact that there are many legislation, even when it comes to sales to minors and so on, that are not properly enforced. So before talking about bringing new regulations, let's look at what we can enforce for now.
Thank you very much. Peter, so your organisation represents the European tobacconists and retailers, and you have stressed before about balanced regulation. So as classic tobacco product sales decline, how are tobacconists adapting, especially regarding alternative nicotine products, in terms of store identity, service offering, and retail compliance?
Well, I have to say, I'm not only the president of the retailers, I'm a retailer myself, so I really know by my handswork what is the outcome of all this transformation. And of course our sector now is really changing. So if we go on the anti-cancer plan, the classical filter cigarette will be less and less, and it's already less and less each year. But there are a lot of newer products, a lot of newer sectors. But this is not harmonized all over my member countries. In some countries it's forbidden, there is not so much regulation, so it's over-regulated, there is too much tax, there is this. So each country has another product which is focused on. So we spoke about nicotine pouches in my country itself, in Austria. I've seen them exploding. So of course everybody has to adopt the shop to put out maybe not tobacco products, but they're selling so much other things like newspapers. So make some place to put a good offer for the customer that he has this choice when he comes into our shops and he wants some nicotine.
Yeah, and it's a key point, isn't it, about the transition or the maturity of consumers as they move through their nicotine journey, what they're likely to want and what their needs are and what the availability is of a particular product. And the adaptation is absolutely important for retailers to keep their eye on the ball and adapt to that accordingly. If we can just move on to the four key areas then first, and let's deal with area one, which is compliance opportunities and challenges. And Peter, we'll just stay with you on this. So what support do retailers need to navigate new compliance demands, like tracking, packaging, warnings, especially as regulations evolve?
Well, tracking, packaging, warnings, these are more concerns the industry. So what we really need is some kind of stability and legality. So we get used to sell sensible products in our shops, and we're a very good place to promote them there. So now we have to turn our shops against these products. But whenever you turn your shop and then 6 months later, oh no, you cannot sell it anymore, or it's too expensive, so because there's a new tax on it. So what we really need is stability, that we can see for the next 5-10 years, okay, it's going this direction, so we can adapt and we can do our very best to follow and to do our job, to bring it to the customer. That's our job, at least. And to give him the choice. Look, there's this, there's this, there's this. Pick your choice, you can get it here. But, so to answer your question, what we really need is stability, because now it's crazy, simply.
Yeah, absolutely. Stability being key, critically key, because if we don't have stability, and then we don't have sensible regulations put in place, so therefore we can't have compliance. So we need to be assured of what types of things are going to be coming down the track, and I entirely understand that. We have a little bit of instability at the moment within the UK with regards to the tobacco and vape bill. Nobody knows when it's really going to land, and we're waiting to see when it does land. People are trying to plan their advertising budgets, for example, for next year, and they don't know what to do. So stability is absolutely critically important. And if we look at nicotine pouches, who I've often said have this kind of regulatory grey area because they don't necessarily have their own single regulation. They fall under GPSR, they fall under the classification of packaging rules, but they're not included in the majority of countries in tobacco law. What is required is stability for that type of product category, because without that, we can't possibly have clear and sensible regulations. We can't possibly have clear guidance for consumers moving forward. Just moving on to you, Ciprian, from an industry perspective then, how are small vape businesses managing compliance disparities across EU member states? What are they doing? Is harmonisation via AIVA feasible, possible?
Well, for many, compliance is a burden, but for some, compliance can be an advantage. We see members investing in compliance, but the real problem is the lack of harmonization. EU, as we all well know, regulates, create legislation main legislation related to vaping and nicotine pouches are the directives. And then you have a directive which is implemented differently in each country, so you end up having 27 different legislations, and that's the real burden that brings to the small and medium enterprises especially. We promote the idea of evidence-based regulations, evidence-based legislation, let's call it, and evidence-based and harmonized, meaning with, there are directives and regulations. We don't want regulations that will be set up exactly at the EU level and then copy-paste it to each level. We will prefer to keep the directive, but in more detail, so that eventually when it's transpose it to the national level, you have much similar legislations from Poland to Germany to France and so on.
Thank you. That makes things a lot easier if we can get that harmonisation as close as possible across Europe. I agree with that entirely. Tim, so based on your regulatory and market overview, please can you tell us about the threat of tax to the nicotine market and how that's likely to impact the novel nicotine sector?
Yeah, I certainly can. I don't think it is a threat, first of all. I think one of the biggest threats in the entire category right now is the illicit trade and the lack of control. Not so much that governments are necessarily missing out on tax, but the fact that consumers are losing confidence in the category. They think it's a wild west. They don't understand why their kids are buying multicoloured products that are advertised with cartoon characters and so on. So I think my view is that some kind of a harmonised tax across Europe is probably a good thing. But there is a big but. I think it very much depends on the level of tax that's applied and the way that it's implemented. So what we're seeing with the excise directive that we saw published earlier this year, I think in general is probably a good thing for the sector, but it's going to take quite a long time to implement. Some of the rates, particularly around pouches, are problematic, I think. The rate that's been set for future implementation as a minimum in European member states is actually pretty much higher than nearly every country that currently applies tax in the European Union. So I think some of those issues are going to be problematic. But as I said, my personal view is all of those problems will fall away if what we see as a result of this tax directive is government stepping up, enforcing properly, making sure that responsible companies are allowed to operate and taking out of the market those that don't want to. So, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, it's about creating a grown-up product, essentially, isn't it? If we apply the tax levels appropriately, so that we're not, pseudo-banning products by applying too high a tax and forcing people back to combustible nicotine, I think that essentially it could be a good thing. And I've taken a very close look at the UK at the moment and how they're applying that tax. Not perfect, but I think that the process and the way that they're delivering it is likely to have a net benefit, I think, across the sector, particularly with regards to the illegal market. Okay, as I said, we'll make this as interactive as possible. So we are on the subject of compliance opportunities and challenges. If there's any questions that have been drawn out from anything that you've heard so far and the audience would like to ask any questions? Wow, you must have done a fantastic job, guys. Mr. Jappy, well, obviously.
Tim, you spoke about tax generally being a good thing. You think it's a good thing. My concern would be that it would push more people to avoid being involved in the legal market and just be involved in the illicit market. So surely there needs to be a lot of enforcement against the illicit market if that's going to work, right? And I don't think we see that at the moment.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what the other panelists think, but you're absolutely right, particularly vape. We think that the majority of the market is illicit. In some markets, clearly, markets like the US, Brazil, or whatever, the market is almost entirely illicit. All I would say is I think that the problem with enforcement up till now has often been that the wrong department in a country has been looking after it. It's often been enforcement by, let's say, the FDA in the US or other health departments in other countries. My experience is as soon as you start a tax being implemented and you start getting the finance ministers involved, then enforcement really tightens up quite fast. We've just started this year, quite interestingly, we started an enforcement tracker, which is actually just tracking the number of enforcement actions that are going on around the world. It's not perfect, we can't track every single country, but we're doing the same methodology month after month, and it's incredible how that graph is going upwards. So we are seeing governments tackle this. We're definitely seeing, I think, public perception around the sector that people are sick of seeing their kids going to buy products that they don't feel are safe. And my view is that, that's a really good thing. Is if governments can start to do that, we're going to start to get back some kind of confidence in the category, and that's got to be a good thing. So, look, I don't know. You're absolutely right. There's still a long, long way to go to try and enforce against some of this illicit activity. But often, the other problem that's going on is often the rules, like you were saying, the rules keep changing. It's very difficult for retailers to understand what the rules are in order to be compliant. Often government, departments, whatever, you've been tracking a lot of the UK enforcement, a lot of people don't really understand what they're trying to enforce against because it's so complicated. So I think that the more that we move towards a standardised, potentially harmonised set of rules across Europe, I think the more we're going to start to see that tighten up. And as I said, I think that would be a good thing. Clearly, if the rules are really tough, if some of the perceived ideas about tax rates or the product restrictions that are going to be brought in are too tough, then we will see an illicit market develop out of that. So it's a balance, and the regulations have to be right. But I think, as time goes on, we're going to start to see what those levels should be. So I'm kind of optimistic about it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'm quite optimistic about that.
Hello. As all of the nicotine products become more innovative and more consumer-centric, which stakeholders have what responsibility in terms of maximizing the harm reduction momentum while minimizing the entry to nicotine for the same product?
Would you direct this? The whole panel, yeah.
Well, I keep saying this for a while. I think the medical world should be much more involved. I mean, everything starts there. The consumers will finally get somebody to validate, because if you just Google it, is it bad, is it wrong, you get mixed messages, and then you end up, choosing whatever you want, what we want to believe. So everything starts with the medical world, which should step in, validate the information, the many studies out there, and eventually the policymakers will listen, because they do right. They listen to the voters eventually. They should do.
I was, maybe a bit difficult to swallow, but I think the concept of harm reduction is dead. I don't think governments are listening to that message any longer. And I think we can keep banging our heads against the wall on this, but I think it's, the pragmatic side of what we do as a business, we don't see that argument really gaining any ground in the near future. Maybe it will in some kind of future world where everyone actually looks at the data and, assesses it. But right now, governments are not thinking around harm reduction. They're kind of much more pragmatically trying to bring in regulations that allow this sector to exist. Whether that's bringing these novel nicotine products within existing tobacco legislation or it's creating new legislation. But I think, when you talk about stakeholders and who's going to be pushing the harm reduction agenda, I don't think it's going anywhere for the next few years, for sure.
Just what I can confirm, we are talking a lot of with stakeholders, politics, decision makers, and whenever you speak about harm reduction, this is a very big topic inside our bowl, because we are all dealing with it. So harm reduction. But on the other side, they don't hear you. The answer is always harm reduction. This is an industrial line. So for the moment, I always say to them, okay, so then take some money, make your own research on it, and then have an opinion. This would be a good thing, but for the moment, all negative. Nobody wants to talk about harm reduction. Anyway, I never met one in the last 5 years from those who make the decision outside our tobacco board.
Yes, I agree. Indeed, there is no place for debate, first of all. And best example, a few years ago, the European Commission assembled a committee called SCARE to look at the many studies out there and come up with a conclusion. They come up with the bad conclusions because they were comparing vaping with fresh mountain air. So that was a clear proof, a very clear proof about their intention. And eventually, some journalists asked during the hearing, but why don't you look at so many independent studies out there? And the answer was, we looked to studies conducted by the accredited organisms by us. So, yeah.
Having said all of that in a really negative way, I mean, that doesn't stop you guys making the arguments, and I think it's really important the industry continues to bang the drum. Harm reduction is important. It's not going to go away. It's only going to become more important. So I suppose I was just saying that slightly negative point, which is I don't think it's being listened to as you said right now. But that doesn't mean we stop talking about it.
It doesn't exist indeed a narrative, but if you look at the latest Tobacco Access Directive proposal, when you look at taxes, tobacco versus vaping, there is a clear differentiation. So we're just missing here. Hopefully somebody will come and insert some narrative at least from the European Parliament position, insert a narrative on a harm reduction, on a risk profile of vaping, so that the TPD will start to build on that.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the narratives in certain governments are different as well in terms of their understanding of what they're trying to achieve through it, because I know that, for example, in the UK, I went to a parliamentary briefing, and during that parliamentary briefing, some esteemed character who I won't name here stood up and talked about recreational nicotine, and one of the members of the House of Lords basically said, don't ever mention recreational nicotine again. We're not interested in that. We are interested in harm reduction, in reduced harm products. Don't mention recreational nicotine, as if it didn't exist.
I will share a quick story here. I just visited my family doctor, and she's been through a transformation, looking better, well-being, healthy life, and she said, now I'm vaping. I was like, why you used to smoke? Why keeping Alzheimer away? That was quite an interesting mention.
Naveed, you got a question?
Yeah. Thanks. Tim, you pulled it back slightly, I think, to the comment I was going to make when you said we should still keep the harm reduction discussion going. I think it's a sad day when we, as an industry, admit that harm reduction is dead. I don't think it is dead. I don't think we've found the way in which we need to communicate with the decision makers out there. And to your point about, you answer the question by saying, we need to convince the medical community. Well, I agree with you. We do need to convince the medical community, but we need to start being much more responsible before we can start convincing the medical community, the way we market our products, the way we position our products. And at the moment, if we've got millions on cans of nicotine pouches, that is not a credible industry that can have a discussion with the medical profession. And I think we also have to consider that none of us in the room want to go down a pharmaceutical route for products like nicotine pouches and vapes. But we also have to understand that the medical community is only convinced by those medical pathways which eventually approve drugs. So we are coming into, it's a completely new arena. We have to work out ways in which we discuss with the medical community, but I think the day that we start saying the space for harm reduction discussion has closed down, we may as well pack our bags and go home.
I agree the medical world should conduct their own studies, but for that we need financing, and you can't really find funding from the government state. And that's when the private sector steps in, but that's where these are not good because the funding is from the private sector. So it's like
Okay.
wrong circle.
Okay, let's. We're just going to move on to the next subject, sir. So see if you can weave it in. I'm sure you'll be able to. Let's start with Peter then. We're talking about sort of cross-border regulatory complexities. So in retail, Peter, how do cross-border disparities challenge supply chains or consistency in consumer experience? For example, differences between EU states in nicotine pouch regulations or any alternative.
Well, as retailer, we have a big experience with cross-border, because Article 32 allows a lot of cross-border flotation, and the prices for cigarettes are very different. But now with the new product, especially with nicotine pouches now, we have a new dimension on it, because in some countries it is forbidden. So there is not a harmonized market with different prices. You have the prices are not so much different than they might be on cigarettes. But what it is that you cannot buy it in some countries. You cannot buy vape products in Hungary. You cannot buy in the future nicotine pouches in France. You cannot buy them already in Belgium. And there are a lot of blogs going up. You cannot buy it even here in Germany, but it's not forbidden. It's just put in the neutral law. So this is another way to forbid this, to take burden to this product. So the dimension we have now that it is forbidden. And when we had the COVID time, the frontiers were closed, and we could really measure in the cigarette terms what was selling. So you can imagine then, for us, for example, in Austria, we had a very good situation. On Hungary, vaping is forbidden. So you can imagine how happy the retailers are on the Hungarian frontier. In Germany, nicotine pouches are forbidden. So a lot of people even take the train to Salzburg, get off, buy nicotine pouches, go back home. So this is really good for us, but it's not very good for the market. It's very bad for the market. And this kind of situation with cross-border, and I didn't even speak about what you can order online. So this is a very new dimension, what we see with the novel products here.
Yeah, if the consumer wants the product, they'll get it essentially, won't they? Whether that's the black market or going cross-border or purchasing the product, they will find a way to access that particular product. I've got a question which probably Tim and Ciprian will want to answer, which is about TPD3 and the Tobacco Excise Directive revisions. They're looming at the moment. What are the cross-border risks and what are the opportunities should companies watch for? Tim, do you want to speak to that first?
Not really.
Okay.
I will. Okay, massive topic. So TPD and Tobacco Excise Directive, again, to put it into context, when we started a business, TPD was just coming through. It was the most important piece of legislation for the vape sector, but not just in Europe, but it affected the way that governments started thinking about regulation around the world. So it's enormously important, this next stage of European legislation. Look, Ciprian is much closer to the machinations of what's going on in Europe, but I mean, what I would say is we've got a commission which seems to be pretty against the category. They seem to be quite comfortable with, for example, bringing in a tax that's likely to destroy the pouch segment. But I think on a very positive note, we've got a category, like I said, that is growing really, really fast. It's already really quite big in Europe. You've got already signs of political support for things like the nicotine pouch industry coming out of Sweden and some of the Nordics. Our personal view and our analysts look at this, but I mean, we think that that the Tobacco Excise Directive is going to go through, and it's not like it's just going to be paused for a long, long time, but there's going to be quite a lot of negotiation around rates. The European Union's appetite for tax right now, any tax receipts, because it needs money, is really high. So we're going to see something come through pretty quickly, but I think we're going to see some more realistic understanding around rates, and I think probably there'll be quite a lot of work done on a political level. Do you?
Yeah. TPD, the words we will mention so many times the next years. So one hand said, the proposal as it looks, indeed the levels are pretty high, but I would say most important, we need to have a big differentiation between tobacco tax and vaping. So eventually it's not about having no tax or low tax, it's having a big differentiation. The biggest problem we see in TED is the ad valorem proposal. I mean, ad valorem, you apply an ad valorem tax when you have a mature market, when you have, like I said, in InterTabac, you have 4 or 5 large companies to deal with, not when you have 10,000 small and medium enterprises. That will create a mess. We end up in the always first rule of management, don't impose something you can't control. So that's one problem we see with that. On the other hand, there are good parts. Again, as I said earlier, there is a clear differentiation in taxation, non-combustible versus combustible. And on the other hand, we will have a harmonization, a so long harmonization, especially coming from countries that have a local excise. We have in Europe countries that tax, I don't know, I think the highest is Portugal, up to 73 cents per milliliter for closed pod systems, and goes down to zero tax in France, for example. So of course, then you have the situation, France is gaining a lot of market shares from neighbor countries, and not only, they can ship from France to Romania in 48 hours for €5. So why the consumers from Romania will start to purchase there when they can order it from France? Fast delivery, cheap delivery. So yeah, harmonization could be a good thing. Going further for TPD, that will also, as I said earlier, will be very important if the European Parliament gives just a position when it comes to that. It will be very important to hear some language, some narrative around harm reduction, because that will be the ground for the TPD. And when it comes to TPD, of course, the main threats and our main worries are around the many flavor bans. We see so many flavor bans here, like partial flavor bans, total flavor bans, almost vape ban if you look at Netherlands. Restrictions that brought, I know in Denmark there are data showing 80% of the vaping market is coming from the black market. They actually look at the recycled vapes and they count it and they end up 80% of the market is black. Or you go in the Netherlands where the drug dealers on the streets in Amsterdam now are selling vapes. They are doing upselling. You ask for vapes and you're getting some other nasty stuff like in McDonald's or a Mac where you get fries with it. So yeah, TPD will be very important, especially this will set up the industry for the next 10 or 15 years. And again, as we carry the responsibility, so we're doing our best, we are coordinating with our members, we are coordinating our lobbying efforts, and hope for the best. For now, we can't say more than that.
Thank you very much. Has anybody got any questions specifically about cross-border, TPD3, keep it direct on TPD3 and the tax? Oh, you're going to weave your question in on it. Well done.
Well, I mean, maybe a little bit cycling back to illicit trade, but also TPD. I mean, I'm sure you hear me, but basically, if I look at TPD1 and TPD2, and one of the major reasons for that was to fight illicit trade. Right? Do we have some hard proof, like data, that it actually reduced illicit trade, like TPD1, TPD2, like now with TPD3? I guess the access directive will not really reduce illicit trade if you increase taxes, but the hard regulations will have they reduced illicit trade?
Tim, have you got any data on that illicit trade?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, we do, and illicit trade is a very difficult topic. It's very difficult to measure because illicit novel nicotine products are a bit like illicit drugs. They're not, people don't tend to tell you about them. They're not easy to measure. You can't just go to a shop and go, give us your illicit products. I think one of the things that is important to distinguish between TPD1 and 2 and where we are now is that the number of products that were available and were being regulated by the last TPD, it was just combustibles, let's remember, and the market is very different. You know, with novel nicotine products, you've got so much more fragmentation. You've got consumers that are frankly used to going to buy products in multiple different retail environments. So it's no longer just going to tobacconists in Europe. It's now going to convenience stores and all sorts of vape stores, which when we started was a massive growth area, online, and then of course all the other kind of typically illicit channels, you know, market stalls and so on. I think it's a totally different world. So even if you did that work to try and understand what impact track and trace has had on the combustibles, I don't think you can kind of apply it to this new sector, would be my view. Don't know, yeah, Peter, maybe you've got views on that.
Yeah, I think so as well. So for the classic cigarette, I think when there is a new regulation now should be better, because all countries inside the EU. Now you have prices for the Marlboro, for example, in Ireland, 18 euros, and you have 3.2 euros in Bulgaria, and they're all fulfilling their regulations. So this harmonization would be more put together. The problem is, and you mentioned it already, what about the countries on the frontier outside, like Greece? They already have a huge problem with all the labors, because it's more than double of the price increase. So it will be triple of the price increase. So you are moving much more people outside. But, well, I think any regulation is better than the Wild West we have now. So,
Careful
hope
what
the
you wish
best.
for.
Of course, black market is influenced by the restrictions and the level of taxation. I give you here 3 examples. First, let's not forget, this is quite a complex market because you have ingredients in the liquids coming from pharma industry, from food industry, from cosmetic, you can find in the cosmetic industry as well. And then you have the hardware, which lately they use even AI, they use even complex software and so on. So it's a very complex product present in different industries, so it's hard to regulate it just in one. And when I say too high restrictions, we look at Denmark, as I was mentioning earlier, 80% black market, Netherlands, I think it's over 90%. And then you look in Italy, when it comes to taxation, 5 or 6 years ago, they imposed a 38 cents per milliliter tax. Government forecast a collection over 100 million, they collected like 5. And they decrease it over the years, over the next 3-4 years, they keep decreasing it. And eventually they end up at 10 cents per milliliter. They forecast they will gather 10 millions, and they actually got like 30 millions. So that's the very, we call that the red line example, with data coming from the financial institution of the Italian government. So, yeah, the level of taxation restriction, that's totally related to the black market, nothing else. And we are living in the world of Google, ChatGPT. You don't fight the consumers, you will always find a way.
Maybe just, sorry, to add to that though, I think it is an interesting question about how will implementation of, whether it's tax, TPD or whatever, how will that be implemented? What will the controls be in place, and how will they be harmonised? Obviously we've got the model of track and trace in combustible cigarettes across Europe. I think there will need to be some kind of system, whether it's track and trace or not, I don't know, but there's clearly going to need to be some kind of a system so that tobacconists in your association can go, okay, yeah, I know this product is okay for me to sell. So, you know, we're not at that stage yet to understand how that's going to be consistent across Europe, but there's going to have to be some system that means that these cross-border effects, Robert, you've been talking about, are ironed out, because, you know, it is a major problem. It's always been a big problem in combustible cigarettes, and it's a massive mountain to climb for novel nicotine products at the moment because of the levels of illicit products in the market.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next subject now. Sorry, so we'll come to you later. Retail sector developments then. So, Peter, how do tobacconists view nicotine pouches and other novel nicotine products? As an opportunity, a threat, or a co-complemented product to existing product lines?
Very clear and short answer, it's a big chance to have it if the regulator lets you sell them. So for us, we are okay for all new products, but we need stability, and some countries of my association, they cannot sell these products anymore. So they would, they can't.
They would, but they can't, yeah. Ciprian, what are you and your members witnessing pan-Europe in the alternative nicotine sector?
Well, we see a lot of changes in the consumer's behavior, especially with the appearance of disposables. So that was the big boom, let's say, when a lot of people finally gave a chance to vaping. I would say mostly because of the cost, because suddenly you're getting the pack of cigarettes, you're getting an e-cigarette compared to before you have to spend, I don't know, 50 euro. They went through that for a while, they realized that that's working for them, and now they're starting to look for cheaper alternatives, like going for the pod system and eventually ending up in the open system. So this market, I'm dealing in this market for almost 14, 15 years, and it's a very dynamic market, very, very fast-moving market. So we advise our members always take care of innovation, always make sure you have diversity for your clients, and in the light of so many restrictions when it comes to communication, find the best way to communicate with your client, your existing client. I mean, there are many models out there, totally legal and totally aiming for the right audience, meaning the adult smoker.
And with regards to sort of market intelligence then, Tim, do we think that these new novel nicotine products, and I'm excluding vape from that, are taking a pinch from the vaping market? Is that having an impact in any shape or form? Or do you think things are steady away and actually this is just a new category where consumers are purchasing?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was just going to step back and remind everyone. I mean, the idea that modern consumers are going to continue to roll up dried herbs, light them and inhale, I think is, we know where that's going. So when you ask just generally where's the opportunity, I think this is a one-way street. We're not going to see cigarettes come back. They're being phased out in Western markets. There's still a massive market. When I talk about $800 billion, that's a big market to shift into new products, but I think it's inevitable. I think it is also really worth noting, like you have, Robert, that now we've got these new innovations coming through. To what extent does it mean that consumers are moving between them? And we are seeing lots of evidence that consumers are multi-using novel nicotine products. They're also still, a lot of them are using combustible products and novel nicotine products. So, there's going to be lots of interaction between these different product categories. But I also see the level of innovation that we have got in the last 10 years, just, in terms of vape, heated tobacco, nicotine pouch, new products coming through, nicotine strips, there's all sorts of new innovations coming through. There will always be that drive, I think, to create products that certain consumer segments want. So not everyone wants to use vape, but they might be much more interested in pouch or heated tobacco or whatever. So, the way I'm seeing it, I think the rate of innovation is going to continue. We're still really early days. If you compare to the length of time that we've had, factory-made cigarettes in the market, this is nothing. This is, we've barely even started, and we've already got really quite sophisticated products in the market. But I don't doubt that over the next 10 years we'll get all sorts of new innovations coming through.
Yeah, personally, I think there's some room for movement with innovations with nicotine pouches specifically. The format is pretty standard across the way, but I think that we are starting to see people bringing out new products that have got, say, for example, a quick release of the nicotine, or a slow release of the nicotine, or a different compound. So I think that there's some movement still to go with that particular sector of the market, and it'll be interesting to see how it develops. How are IEVA members kind of preparing for the evolution of this category then?
As I said earlier, we always in IEVA it's about exchanging the info. We have already 70 national trade association plus some 30 companies. So we're always exchanging what is happening in Portugal. Everybody finds out immediately what it's. So this is a way we're preparing, sharing the information, sharing good examples, bad examples, trying to sync our communication, trying to speak with one voice, no matter if it's the client or no matter if it's the policymaker.
Excellent. Thank you for the work that IEVA does. It really is very excellent. Peter, what should retailers do to future-proof their businesses, i.e. new services, customer education, diversification? What types of things should they do?
Well, we have 130,000 small family-run businesses, so I mentioned small. So the average surface of a shop is 60 square meters, so we cannot put in each product. So I think it's very logical. People will come and look for nicotine products in our shops, so we should have them all. So make place that what we concern. When we speak to policymakers, we say, well, better not be sold online, the new products. We can offer it to sell in our shops, we are prepared. We make use control. Even we advise our shops now to make use control if it's not legally necessary in some countries. So to have a much better image and proper image of those new products. I think that's what we all have to work on.
Thank you, Pete. You've almost answered actually your last question, which I was giving you an opportunity to talk about strategic takeaways for retailers, and you've pretty much answered it there in that question. So I'm just going to ask Tim and Ciprian now. First of all, Ciprian, I'm going to ask you to do a 1-minute summation of what key message would you want to get across, something compelling to policymakers or industry partners to accelerate reasonable harm reduction paths. What would you say? What would you do?
Well, we always ask is to policymakers, simple, don't regulate risk-reduced products like you regulate tobacco cigarettes. Give it a chance, because this will support the harm reduction, the harm reduction act goals. Let's not forget the Beating European Cancer Plan, where the European Union took the responsibility to cut down the smoking rate from 23 to got down to 5%. So they kind of promised to take out over 90 million smokers out of the smoking, and it's obvious that there were many regulations aimed to decrease the smoking rates. They were effective until some point. Now we need something new. So they need to understand that vaping pouches and other non-combustible nicotine delivery systems, let's call them, are part of the solution, are not the problem.
Tim, have you got a key compliance or market insight message that people should act on now? Something that you think you want to get a key message across?
I think our business is not really about, lobbying and getting key messages across. What I would say is my view remains that this is a massive opportunity for the sector. It's a tide that is going in one direction, I would say this, but I think understanding the really complex dynamics out there is super important to understand what your strategy is. The old world of combustible cigarettes is very steady, very easy to understand, very well tracked. This is a sector that is very new, very fast moving. There's massive opportunities, but there's also enormous mistakes that people have been making over the last 10 years. And so trying to understand it both from a regulatory landscape perspective, but also what's happening to consumers in the market is super important.
Thank you very much. We've got 2 minutes for any last questions.
Thank you. It's been said several times on the subject of policymakers saying no to harm reduction. The concept is dead. I live in Europe for many years, but I don't really understand European politicians. So, yeah. So what's your analysis on what's the reason? Was there a discussion in your, they must have a discussion, logical discussion. How do they come to the conclusion that they decide to say, no, we don't want to discuss about this subject with the industry?
Okay, I'll go, and then you do the political kind of side. I think it's very easy. If you go out of this building and go and ask the average person on the street what they think of the product, it will be generally quite negative still. And politics, whatever you think of it, it generally reflects what's going on in the public's opinion about things. And so it's too early. I think these sectors are still new, and they're seen in largely negative terms by the general public. You just have to read the media about this to see that, and that is reflected in what politicians do. So I think it's inevitable, and these guys are really out there beating the drum, and I think that's really important. And gradually things will change, but I think we have to accept the fact that this is really complicated and generally seen quite negatively by the general public.
Just maybe to give you an example to understand, so whenever we are talking to decision makers outside our tobacco bowl, I usually say I represent 130,000 small family-run businesses. This is a door opener. And I tried to, in all the conversation, to mention the word tobacco as last as possible. Because whenever I mention it, budge. That's how it runs for the moment. But you're right, it's not logical. And we don't understand as well.
First, I think everybody heard it in the past months or years, like European Union needs to reform a bit the way they regulate. Because they tend to complicate things, and look where we end up in terms of technology. We kind of lost the race. We are far behind, especially due to this very complex regulatory system. When it comes to harm reduction, I would split the policymakers in three. There are those pro-harm reduction, usual some industries are around them and influence them. Then we have those very strict against harm reduction, which are usual those who don't even want to debate. And those, of course, they are influenced by some certain industry. And most of them in between, which they act like, I'm not touching this. This is too controversial. So that's, I would say, the radiography of the EU current regulation.
Can I just also mention, we
could talk on for a while, but we are out of time.
Okay, very quickly. Well, we did a survey.
Achtung, Achtung, liebe Besucher. Wegen eines technischen Defektes muss die Halle geräumt werden. Bitte verlassen Sie umgehend die Halle und folgen den Anweisungen von Feuerwehr und Ordnungsdienst. Ich wiederhole, die Veranstaltung ist beendet. Bitte verlassen Sie die Halle. Drängen Sie nicht, aber bewegen Sie sich zügig zu den Ausgängen. Bitte bewahren Sie Ruhe und helfen Sie bedürftigen Personen. Die Garderobe wird nicht ausgegeben. Über das weitere Vorgehen informieren wir Sie über Megafon. Attention, attention please, ladies and gentlemen. Because of a technical problem, we need to evacuate the hall. Please leave the hall immediately and follow the instructions of our security staff and the fire department. I repeat, the event is over. Please leave the hall. Don't push, but leave the hall by the shortest way to the exit.